maybe weren't able to join us today, as we're kind of halfway through the kind of comment period for the work group principal. So we just want to be able to give this as an input to support that feedback period. So great to see everybody. This is Dave Altstadt with JFF, and joined on the line as well with Ashley Bliss Lima. And in a moment, we'll do introductions. So Ashley, maybe you want to flip to the next slide. So we have an hour today or thereabouts. Here's what we're hoping to do. We will give a brief overview, show to you, kind of go through the document and show you where we ended up after our conversation in March. Made a number of kind of fine tuning. We were able to, build on the principles and discussion that we had, and want to definitely hear your feedback on where things are resonating, where things seem to be off base, what might be missing, what we might want to, what you may not agree with, or would advise that we fine tune. So that's the goal, and so we'll follow up with that, and then we'll go through some next steps. So before I get into kind of Ashley and I get into the overview and some of the setup, let's just do a quick round of introductions so everyone knows who's on the line.
Good afternoon. I'm Denise King. I'm Vice President for Academic Affairs at Cleveland State Community College.
Hi, this is Jack Hershey, President of the Ohio Association of Community Colleges.
Hi, Madeline Fumariega here.
Hi, Madeline. I think that leaves you, Aaron.
Hi, Aaron Fickner from the Council of County Colleges in New Jersey.
All right, well, great. Well, from what we saw, I think Michael Bastian and Glenn DuBois weren't able to join us. It looked like Mike Hansen from Michigan and Russell Lowry Hart from Amarillo might be able to come. They might just be a few minutes late. So we'll get started and we'll check for them as they may jump on. So, okay, so just wanted to quickly give a recap about where we are in this process. So there was a bunch of legwork that we did in advance of the March meeting. Then we had our March meeting. And right now where we are in the process is gathering the work group feedback on the draft document with the goal of reaching consensus as a group of what we want to put forward to the full trust for their consideration. The full trust will be meeting this July to work through all three of the kind of deep dive areas, this being college promise, but we have two other areas that they're exploring: dual enrollment and connecting students to careers. And there's a lot of intersections and overlap and synergy around those three areas, which is exciting to see. And then from there, it's our full intention to launch a kind of communications and advocacy plan to elevate the perspectives of the Policy Leadership Trust in this area, and to partner with members to get the word out in different groups to kind of inform and influence national policy discussions and where appropriate and helpful state-specific conversations. So that's kind of where we're headed, and I just wanted to do that context setting again as we dig into this. So next slide. Just as a reminder, so I talked about consensus. This is, as I've mentioned before, this is a product of the trust, not, so it really should resonate and it's kind of fully embraced it by the group. And so this is our kind of decision-making process that we go through. So, we don't, as I mentioned before, we don't hold formal votes. We're not going to be saying yes or no in this meeting, but we are looking for how we can capture the kind of the prevailing views of folks. So if someone makes a point that you agree with, it would be helpful to hear if someone else chime in and say, yes, I agree too. Just as it's your turn to talk, it's just helpful to know that there's multiple people kind of agreeing on the same point. Just keep that in mind. We'll after this conversation, please also continue to share your feedback. Welcome an email or a marked up Word document with any other feedback that you weren't able to provide. And, it'll be our job is to make the necessary updates to the document and then convey this back out to the group so that you can see the changes that we made and just want to make sure, look at that and make sure that it resonates with where you think we landed. The last point I'll say is that, especially as we dig into high-profile issues like college promise, we recognize that there might be some points of disagreement. And while it's for us, we can't expect 100% a consensus. We're going to go with the prevailing view, just for the comfort. Just so you know, we do put a kind of a disclaimer on our documents that clarify that the positions of the Policy Leadership Trust don't necessarily reflect the individual views of members. So that's just something to keep in mind. The last thing I'll just say was, we have a few folks on the call that are part of the work group. You're sharing your perspectives to inform the deliberations of the trust. We'll talk about later, we can sort out, as we publish this, the kind of acknowledgement section of how we share who is part of this process. So I wanted to just go through that real quickly. I'll pause there for a second if anyone has any kind of burning questions or observations around this part of it. Okay. Ashley? So just to give you a little bit more schema about what you're looking at, hopefully you see the you have the document in front of you. We were thinking about some of the discussion that we had and thought that we needed to not just present a series of principles, but to lift up a few things at a kind of higher level, overarching set of goals or drivers. And so that's where this language around commitments came from. It seemed to resonate across all three of the work groups. And so the commitments are these sort of must-dos, the things that we think are necessary to achieve the vision for, in this case, college promise, as the Policy Leadership Trust sees. So those are, there's two that have been named by this group. I think we might have talked about them as goals before or something of that nature, but that's what that is. Then we have the series of principles, and these are the shoulds, what we think should inform the design of policy in state or federal ways. And then underneath those principles are a series of potential or optional kind of policy recommendations or levers, different ways to realize that vision or those set of principles. This is not an exhaustive list. We can add to it, we can subtract to it, but some things that came out of our discussion as well as things that JFF might have pulled into for your consideration. But that's what this looks like, and I'm going to turn over to Ashley now, who's going to do a quick overview of these key areas.
Hi, everyone. Very good to see you since we met last time in DC. Thank you for joining the call today. I hope you had a moment to read through the document prior to the call today, and if not, I think you should still be able to follow along easily, given that these points of view came from this group. And we just ask that if you can look at the document after. that would be fantastic. I'm just going to I'll stay more at a high level, just since I know you have the document for sake of time. I'll start with the commitments, just the 2 that we identified, and then I will move into the 6 principles that we identified as a group together in DC, and I will highlight some of the policy levers. And if you recall from our meeting, we sort of got into the policy levers at the very end of the conversation, so we didn't dig into it too much. So we brainstormed on our side and added a few, but really welcome, think of them as a draft, really welcome your feedback. Would love to hear of more if you have ideas or thoughts, and happy to edit and remove as well. So starting with commitments, the 2 that we really honed in on as a group together was 1, an attention to equity, and 2, a focus on talent development and economic impact. And we had talked about these commitments, as Dave said, as, very kind of umbrella, overarching commitments to all the principles. So these were issues that kept coming up in our conversation that we really felt needed to be weaved within all of the principles. They couldn't just be a principle itself. So, the attention to equity essentially states that, promise programs must be intentional in their design and implementation, with intentions to reduce and not reinforce gaps in equity in college access and completion. Closing equity gaps should be a primary commitment of post-secondary policy and reform efforts, in order to strengthen talent pipelines and, of course, expand opportunities for the advancement of all workers and learners. The second commitment that we stated was the focus on talent development and economic advancement. Really just stating that promise programs must support the state's talent pipeline, address the skills gap, and drive economic advancement for all students. Saying that each student who participates in and completes any degree or credential with the support of a Promise scholarship should have a seamless pathway in place for a marketable, in-demand, and family-sustaining job and career. I want to pause there and take any thoughts or questions, just immediate. We'll have time at the end of this presentation to hear your thoughts, but is there any immediate reactions?
Jack, I'm thinking maybe this might be a place where you might just share. You raised the point before about focusing on this or on talent development.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, sorry. I've logged in 3 times, so I'm going to talk fast in case I get dumped out again. I just wanted to make sure that, everybody was comfortable. I thought that this section on talent development was where we had the most conversation. I thought at least in Washington, and I assume that we all thought about it a little bit after Washington to see if we were comfortable with it. I think it, as we discussed there, it's a little bit of a different spin on normal college promise programs. I generally feel comfortable with it, but especially as you get into the policy design principles, especially the first one where we talk about that leads into us focusing on credentials of value in the labor market and not necessarily free college for all, that can be dicey in certain states. Mine is not one of them, but I wanted to make sure that we heard perspectives of those who thought it might be dicey in their states.
Hey, Jack, this is Mike Hansen. And I think what I'm going to say is related to your question and concern. Without this focus or commitment in Michigan, we would have never gotten the Republicans on board. So they're not as impressed and therefore supportive of a general college promise kind of program. But when it's connected to things like what we're calling an adult reconnect a la Tennessee, and the emphasis on closing the skills gap, meeting labor market demands and employer demands for talent, it becomes from a political standpoint, much more supportive.
So Ashley, I'm going to suggest that you move to the next principle, and so that we can hit this point straight on around principle number 1 and credentials of value, because there's, I think, a big, kind of decision point for the group on what this might necessarily mean.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. So the next slide, you'll see the 6 principles identified here. I'm just going to run through them at a high level, and then we can discuss after. So first one, the focus on credentials of value in the labor market. Promise programs should put students, like we mentioned earlier, on a durable and seamless path to economic advancement. The Promise Scholarship should encourage and incentivize students to enroll and complete high-impact, high-quality programs of study and in-demand careers that then lead to a better job, family-sustaining wage. Promise programs, so here's where we really, I think, want to confirm and clarify and seek the group's input on this, but essentially stating that Promise programs should therefore not be universally available, but rather dependent on the student's program of study. So I'll just pause on that piece and that one question that we have and seek your insights on how you all feel about that piece.
Can you hear me? This is Russell.
Hey, Russell.
How are you?
Could you say your last sentence again?
Yes. And it's listed, it's written in the document as well on the top of the 3rd page.
Okay.
But Promise programs, so this is essentially getting at the fact that if we are saying that the Promise Scholarship should be encouraging and incentivizing students to enroll in programs of study that lead to in-demand careers, that lead to a better job, and a family-sustaining wage, which are inclusive of industry-recognized in-demand certificates as well, pathways to bachelor's degrees, etc. So the question is, do we want to say that Promise programs should therefore not be universally available to all programs of study, but dependent on what that program of study and degree is, given that we want to make sure it's leading to a pathway to a job, career, and high wage?
Ashley, your sound is going in and out.
Oh, I can hear her. But
I can too.
Okay.
Denise, we can hear you. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you right now, but the sound was indeed going in and out. So, and there was somebody else on the line who said something, and I couldn't hear what that was either. So I've got my volume up all the way.
That was Russell, and so Denise, if you can hear me, that was Russell from Amarillo, and he was just asking me to repeat the statement. So we're talking about the statement on the top of the 3rd page, which is really just seeking the group's input if what we want to say is that the Promise program should not be available necessarily to all programs of study, but dependent on the program of study and degree. If what we're saying is that we want it to make sure it's leading to a better job in an in-demand field with a family-sustaining wage, etc.
This is Mike in Michigan again. I would be more comfortable, I guess, if that sentence came out. I'm not sure we want to be in the business of defining what that is and dictating that. I think that should be left up to the individual students, their colleges, and their region. But it's not. I'm not going to die on the hill for it, but I would be more comfortable with it out.
I might die on that hill, though, for the same reason. Could you soften it by saying Promise programs should focus on targeting students for in-demand fields, but not say it should be exclusive to those?
It's Madeline. I agree. I was going to say, maybe Promise programs could be a state strategy for meeting talent demands in high wage areas, because later on we say keep it simple. And it's almost like that's a contradiction of keeping it simple, because you get in the business of having to define what are the programs of study and degree that fall under promise programs.
Excellent.
I agree with everything that's been said so far, and I would further observe that this devalues liberal arts studies, and I think that we had a very lively conversation about the value of philosophy degrees and ethics and those things that can go with us into graduate programs and help develop leaders for our nation as well, not just workers.
Okay. Thank you for the feedback. This is all helpful, and I think exactly the kind of feedback we were looking for. So we will make those edits, and then we'll make edits and send you all the line again just to make sure you're comfortable with it. We'll pull that out piece. I'll pull that piece out for you in particular. So unless there's anything else, I'll just move on to the other principles. Okay. So the second principle is about, allow for flexibility, and essentially stating that states and federal government, of course, should invest in the College Promise program to bring the program to scale across the state, but they should leave the program design and implementation decisions largely up to the local areas, so to the college, to the region. And states and the federal government should fiscally support and incentivize the local programs. They may provide accountability and reporting structures. They may develop statewide aims for the regions and institutions to strive toward, or they may create a permeable framework for implementation that accommodates local context and acknowledges local and regional needs. Are there any initial thoughts on this one? Okay, I will move on to the next principle, which is keep it simple. And essentially that the Promise program should exist with minimal bureaucracy for the institution, really thinking about streamlined, transparent processes. For example, we discussed in DC an alignment with institutional or system financial aid criteria and processes at the institution to avoid additional and undue administrative burden. We also talked about that the program should exist with minimal eligibility requirements for the student. So essentially a no strings attached approach. I'll pause for any immediate reactions.
By that, do we mean no strings attached to gaining access to the program, or there are no expectations of performance to be able to continue in the program?
Nothing, I think what we're saying is nothing out of the ordinary. So rather than having like a 3.0 requirement or something else, or you have to you have to get a job in your state, you have to stay as a resident, pass a drug test, like all those things that are popping up. We're saying the discussion was no to those extra burdens. Now, a mentorship or something of that nature, like I think we talk later. Remind me, Ashley, we talk later about like tying this to student success efforts.
Yeah, and I just want to say to that question, in addition to Dave's points, what we list and what we are really saying in the document is that not tying the program to any academic or performance requirements. So really ensuring for both entry and persistence to ensure, access and completion. So it is that entrance into and participation in is how we state it in the document. But to Dave's point, one of the other principles that we state later, which I'll get into, is, around the ecosystem of success, and that is thinking about what other support structures and what are things the student should engage in that obviously help ensure completion for the student, the necessary supports.
This is Madeline. The only thing I would say, and I agree with what I think we're trying to say, but I do believe there are already promise programs, particularly around performance. I agree with the what we discussed about drug testing and the employment and staying in the state. That we had that conversation, and that really doesn't align to the equity that we're trying to do these promise programs through a real lens of equity. But I do believe we go from a recommendation to being a little bit more prescriptive in the way that we write it, without any context to why we're saying it shouldn't be tied to academic performance requirements, for example, when most states are moving towards accountability measures and everyone being accountable. So I don't know if we can rework the language to capture the essence of not excluding those that may be hard to hire, or may not be able to stay geographically in the location where they're educated because there are no jobs there.
Yeah, I think some greater clarity around what the kinds of performance requirements that we're objecting to here, or warning against would be very helpful. Because otherwise it looks like you don't have to, that there's no obligation at all on the part of the student to either, to do anything but show up, and later on my concern is just to participate in some kind of support, but you're not expected to actually produce good work and have a minimum. I would have some minimum academic performance, yes. Being engaged in particular work requirements, or a certain kind of status, no. But.
Okay. No, I hear you all. That's helpful. We will. Sounds like we just need some more clear. If we're going to keep that in there, it sounds like you're okay with it, but we want to be more clear on what we're referring to while still, just to Madeline, to your point, because there are states moving in that direction. So let's be more specific around which requirements we're maybe warning against. Okay.
Right, or even highlighting best practices, because the ones we're warning against, we really think is a shortcoming. Maybe that's the only way the state got support to be able to do it, but maybe even what are those real simple best practices on programs that are yielding the type of success we would like this to yield?
Do we, I'm just wondering, thoughts on whether we think promise scholarships should go above standards on satisfactory academic progress?
I do not think they need to be above standard academic progress expectations, but would not want them to be set below either.
Of course, yeah. So I think we're, to that point, I think we're saying like there's no expectation for the students. I think what we're trying to say is that the expectations should be aligned with like the current structures or expectations of like whatever, financial aid or however we want to say that, which
that there should be no difference.
No difference, exactly.
A promise student is treated just like any other student by policy, process, rules, that kind of stuff. That's what
That's helpful.
Yeah, that was helpful. Okay.
It would just be really inequitable to say if you're a promise student, you have to overperform academically to earn your promise. I don't like that at all.
Right. Which that was what we talked about in DC. Okay. That's helpful. Thank you. The next one on accountability. So a commitment to accountability of all the parties involved. So promise should ensure a shared accountability by all parties involved. we identified those as the state, the institution, the student and/or student and family, and the community and local industry. And to support accountability and continuous improvement, all parties should make certain commitments. And we outline those in this document. State government, the commitment obviously as a primary funding source, they should ensure their funding is a long-term, sustainable, and stable. And the funding should cover expenses beyond tuition and fees. Accountability for the institution is the success of the program should be tied to student performance and completion outcomes. And those being pathway to bachelor's degree, job prospects, and attainment after the student graduates, with, of course, special effort and attention to closing the equity gaps, which it's the high-level commitment. Accountability on behalf of the students. The students should arrive to college and into the program invested in their education, committed to a timely completion, with other additional support structures that they may be given for success while engaged in the program, but also at the school. The program should include commitments for the student to complete throughout their academic journey, and we gave a few examples here, such as mandatory academic and career advising sessions and/or engagement in work-based learning. If you all have any other thoughts here for other examples, I think they would be good and helpful to include. Do you all have any, and we can come back to this, but maybe just immediately, do you have any initial thoughts on other support systems, infrastructure the student should be engaged in for like a funds program?
And I'm also just kind of reflecting on what we were just talking about. I mean, what Denise was bringing up, that maybe the commitment is their kind of expectation of academic performance, and like any other, in parentheses, like any other student, but we're saying they're not just to show up, like they should take a investment in their education. So I'm curious about what other commitments beyond that we would want to call out.
Right.
I mean, this is Jack. The one that pops into my head is because we're thinking through the whole ASAP replication here in Ohio, is a minimum commitment of credits that you're either attempting, completing, something along that line of thought.
Okay, thanks, Jack. Are there others that come to mind right now? Okay, let me move into the next two. Following that is, the principle on sustainable and stable funding.
Hey, actually, I don't think that is the last thing about community, local industry. I don't know if you called out that commitment.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me find that.
Actually, I also have a question about the institutional, or the accountability for institutions.
Yeah, why don't you ask that, and then I'll cover the last one.
So I guess I have two concerns or questions with that. First, I'm not sure what the penalty or outcome would be for an institution that for some reason was seen to not meet whatever benchmark on student performance and completion outcomes would be. I mean, would we envision those institutions therefore not qualifying as a promise kind of institution? So if you had a statewide promise programs, it would only be for institutions that met certain completion or outcome measures. I mean, so in other words, the practical effect of policing or enforcing this, I think, gets complicated. And then the second point on that is the fear that if there were some kind of penalty or negative consequence, would that encourage selectivity? Why would an institution take a risk at somebody that came in reading at the third grade level if these performance outcomes were too onerous? Not that I'm against accountability. I mean, we need to have some kind of accountability, and everybody, I think, would support that. It's just putting those into practice, I think, sometimes can get tricky.
And I think that's the project that individual states will approach at their own, by their own criteria. You know, you're absolutely right that we do have in Tennessee accountability for student performance, and if we do not meet those performance expectations with our students, then there are financial consequences. You know, you can earn money, you can lose money based on how you do. So there are. You're absolutely right.
You know, maybe is it better if we say something along the lines of an institution should demonstrate a commitment to student performance and completion outcomes? I mean, I remember the conversation in Washington, which resonated with me, was if we're dumping a promise program on top of a college who is doing things the same way they've been doing it for 20 years, are we actually helping people? But I'm sensitive to this. I don't know how you measure it, so maybe it's just a more broad statement that says the college should demonstrate their commitment to these ideals.
I like that.
With I would also include in there that they should have goals and expectations, develop goals and expectations around performance. Whether they should be penalized for them, you know, is a whole other issue. But
right.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Thank you for raising that, Jack.
Uh-huh.
We will adjust. And so the one that I missed was the very last one. So the community and local industry, thinking about how they can be accountable to the college, the students, and the Promise program students. So essentially, the local community, business, and industry should commit to supporting and engaging with Promise students. And maybe, you know, we had talked about as a group in DC that maybe that looks like opportunities for work-based learning, for registered apprenticeships, internships, and we also mentioned maybe it's a commitment to hire graduates from their local colleges.
It could also be like a, you know, investment. They could be making investment of funding for Promise programs.
Are there any immediate thoughts on that one? Okay, thank you. So I will move. Let me just now get over to. Okay, so we're on sustainable and stable funding. It's like a tongue twister. So here's what we said, that a state college Promise program should ensure the promise will not be broken. You know, so prior to implementation of the program, the state should have already identified long-term permanent funding source. One, you know, caveat that we included was that this source should not pull from funds that currently serve the institution or its students. So we don't want to pull from something that takes away from other impacts on the student. And, you know, let's see. Yeah, I mean, that's the gist of it. Is there any input on that one, on that principle?
I thought this section was really nice and clear.
It's Madeline. I would just consider where we add this source should not pull from funds that currently serve the institution. Maybe we can add, because the intention of Promise programs is to increase access into the workforce or into a talented workforce. So there's a rationale as to why, because some institutions may just package some of their things that they're doing now into Promise programs and repackage as a way to get students who may not think there's a feasible pathway to their local college one. So, if one of the principles that we believe is, equity and access, then maybe that's the rationale behind this one.
Jack, you were earlier you said you were going to talk about, you had a point that you wanted to say about this one?
I don't think I did on this one.
Okay.
It might have been the point. I think I was calling back to the not drawing back because it was Scott's point.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you, Madeline. The last principle, a holistic ecosystem of success. So a promise program should feed into a broader commitment to student success on behalf of the institution. A program should be developed only when the implementing institution is ready to align and integrate it alongside a broader comprehensive institutional transformation or reform strategy. Of course, an example of guided pathways. Any thoughts on this one?
So this is Aaron. Sorry, I had to be off the call for a few minutes, but I think this is a really, really important point, and I almost would argue that this should be the first or second point that we make. So we're in the midst of implementing a promise program in New Jersey, and I think one lesson that we have learned is the discussions and the policy development around it has not been fully integrated with larger efforts, and I think we are seeing some challenges in that regard. And so I think this is fundamentally a really, really important point that I would advocate for making it more prominent in our document.
I concur with that, Aaron.
Yeah, I'd support that too.
Okay, great. We will move that up. Okay, I'm going to now I'll quickly move into the next slide on the policy levers. And so for sake of time, I won't get into each of the levers that we identified, but just generally speaking, we did group them into categories or type of lever for each of the 6 principles. Whether capacity building, funding, governance and system alignment, or a directive, or a lever that enables policy or other incentive or incentivizes. So those are generally the categories that we lump these into. Of course, this list is by no means exhaustive, and we really welcome, if there's any that you just don't think are feasible, they don't align, please let us know, or something that's missing. We would love to have more, happy to add more examples. We did just want them to be realistic and feasible. So is there any thoughts on generally the levers, the policy levers, for any of the principles?
I like it that the Keep It Simple one has a single policy lever.
Yeah, that would be ironic if we had 6 policy levers on the Keep It Simple. Okay.
So I might suggest we just skip to slide 11, and so I just want to make sure. So we were going through kind of principle by principle, just talk briefly about the levers. I just wanted to pull up a second here and just look globally, big picture. You've heard a lot of stuff. We've had a lot of different conversations here and in DC, and just want to do a check here on what's resonating, what's missing. Now that maybe you've been thinking about stewing on, thinking about something that someone said or that we articulated on the document that you don't agree with, what might that be? I just love to do a kind of a round robin around that. Maybe Russell, if you want to go to you and see what's on your mind right now.
Well, the state policy piece is on my mind, and it probably isn't something that's worthy of conversation collectively with this work, because I built a locally specific promise program, and I'm worried that my state policy conversations are going to get in the middle of it, and I don't want them to. I like the local flexibility that we have with the local partners, and so the whole concept of keeping it simple is really, really, really important to me.
So do you feel like this is like cross purposes, or that?
Well, my fear is that as we start moving into state and national policy, it becomes more prescriptive than I would want it to be. That there needs to be some clear guidelines, and that's what I like about the conversations we have. And I just like that there can be room for communities to carve out something that's specific to their community within the guidelines that we've listed. I just worry in Texas. I don't want legislators to get in the way of good practice and good policy at the local level. I'm in the middle of that in separate issues. I'm really sensitive about it to this conversation.
Yeah. I think that seems in line with like kind of the thrust of where we were going with this. We were trying to emphasize the point about it being flexible and simple for local. But I guess we had a few different kind of conversations. We're also trying to make the point that like the vision of a promise program shouldn't just be access. We want to be thought leaders in saying that, hey, we should use this to for talent development reasons, and so therefore, you start going down that line. You start creating a purpose.
So let me clarify. I love what we've created because this is what's on my mind. Like, this is what I'm worried about in my own context. And I think what we've created would give me a tool that I could take with me to protect what I've created. And does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
It's not in complaint of or reaction to. It's more of an affirmation that this is what we need. And so maybe when you ask what was on my mind is I'm worried about losing what we have because some idiot politician doesn't like the concept of it.
Yeah.
And what the conversations we have, I think, give me tools to protect it.
Oh, good. What about you, Madeline? What's on your mind?
No, I echo Russell. Like, I think if we look at the momentum of promise programs right now, they seem to be those local partnerships, areas that are focused on talent and educational attainment. And so, how do we insulate where that is kind of the momentum that's happening with our document? That when someone does read it, like Russell says, it aligns to whether you're having a statewide goal of doing a promise program, but it also supports to what may be happening in your state already with local partnerships. And I think about like some of the partnerships we're seeing now emerge on unrelated to promise programs, but college savings plans. We're seeing lots of cities starting to do college savings plans for every kindergartner. And so this is kind of along the line where a state may not take that perspective, but a local city, especially focusing on breaking the cycle of poverty, does. And so, that's what's weighing on my mind.
Mm-hmm. Mike, what's on your mind? What's resonating? What's missing? Anything that you don't agree with?
No, I think for the most part, this is a good, positive, and useful document. I mean, I echo what both Russell and Madeline have said, but I guess maybe more comfortable that this document allows for that. flexibility and local input. So I think it's in the right direction.
Aaron, are you there?
I am here, and
Okay.
so I would echo what everyone is saying. I think this is a strong document, a helpful framework. I think you all did a great job of hitting on all of the important points. I think the workforce and economic development piece is really important, as long as states have some flexibility, or local areas or whatever have some flexibility in interpreting that the way they need to. The comprehensive issue, the focus on equity, I think you've touched on all of the key points that we've talked about. So I think it's a strong and helpful document.
Okay, well, good. I'm glad where we're landing here. We'll make these tweaks and make the updates, but I'm glad to just get a general sense that, from the group, that we're on the right track. What about you, Denise? Anything missing or anything that you want to raise?
Well, I had a hard time hearing Russell and Madeline, and I understand there's some concerns around maybe it's the language that it seems to be the document itself is addressed towards looks like it's addressed towards state level legislatures and policymakers. And so the local aspect is kind of buried underneath. So I don't know whether we might want to say a state or local college promise program, at some point to open the window there, to imply that it is not all necessarily driven from the state level. But,
good point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right. We don't have to say this throughout. We say a state college promise program, right? We could just say college promise.
Whether at the state or local level, however we want to define that. Otherwise, I'm very comfortable with this document. I think we've done some great work together, and you guys have captured the essence of what we have been discussing.
Jack, any kind of parting thoughts here?
Well, listening to those comments, the one thing that I'll say that I'm still struggling with here is I think the two commitments are very good. I think the policy design principles are very good. The policy levers, I will confess, that's the part that gives me a little pause, because I don't think we're necessarily comprehensive in it. Some seem a little better than others. I'm listening to Russell's point and wondering a controversial statement of whether we need them. Does the policy levers actually reinforce that this is a state level discussion in a way that we're not intending to? And maybe I'd feel different after we did some more work on the policy levers to make them more comprehensive. But a lot of them feel like, well, some money should go towards the idea that we already addressed in the principle. And I think if you buy into the principle, then necessarily you're understanding that some resources have to flow towards it. So I don't know. That's a curveball that I'm admitting I'm throwing into the conversation, and I'm sorry, but
I'm glad for you to do it. It's definitely been something weighing on our minds. The policy lever area is the most underdeveloped. It's the one area that's kind of underdeveloped, and we, like Ashley said, we didn't spend a lot of time as a group, and I think it's fair to say across the other couple work groups too. So it's an area that we thought we were. There was some encouragement, among the co-chairs of the trust, that we get specific and think about policy levers. But I do think as we kind of reflect and get ready for the July meeting, we should revisit. Do we include the policy levers? If so, we need to do a whole, really kind of scrutinize and fine tune them further to do that. So that's definitely something. It's an open question. And maybe it's different for different groups too.
Hey, Dave.
Yeah.
It's Mike Hanson again. And I don't want to, upset the apple cart too much after we're pretty close to being comfortable with this. But in terms of the commitments, I mean, clearly the attention to equity is important, and clearly the talent development piece is important. But it seems like we're missing something on this notion of universal access. Making sure that really the intent here is to remove at least the financial barrier, but hopefully other barriers around everybody's ability to access post-secondary education, and a commitment to that access. But that to me seems like a pretty important part of the intent of a Promise program.
Maybe we can, does that fit under equity if we just state it more clearly, this commitment to access, the universal access?
It could.
It sounds kind of like, to me, it's the underlying assumption of doing a Promise program at all.
Yeah,
and so
right.
Maybe I would argue that it might need its own commitment. This is what a Promise program does. It provides access.
Yep.
What are the other pieces of that they follow is that it's access and equitably, it's access with a purpose.
Well, I'll just jump in. I mean, I think we will have, and we'll push back, but, we'll have some introductory language, of course, when we kind of finalize what this looks like. So if we didn't want to make it, I think putting it under equity is a smart move, just making it more clear. And then I think stating it again, that the group really agrees, entering these conversations, that this was, a given in terms of the point of a Promise program.
I like your points, Denise, around the adding access equitably and for a purpose. Because I think what we were also saying as a group that the current construction of Promise programs as just access isn't enough. And that's where this talent development discussion came from, and a lot of the other pieces. But it's something to build on, to be it's like the fundamental part of this that we're not saying as clearly. It's almost like the stated law already around why a Promise program is for access. But yeah, we'll revisit this. And so anyway, so I know we're at time. In fact, we're beyond time. So I just want to flip to the next slide really briefly and just say we're halfway through this 2-week kind of, Ashley, if you can flip, this like comment period. So if anything else is on your mind that you've been thinking about, ruminating on during today's webinar, I just invite you to come send us an email to take the document, mark it up with comments or track changes or something of that nature, whatever is the easiest way for you to share your perspectives. We'd appreciate getting your feedback by June 3rd. So about a week from now, we're going to then work through the edits and get it back first with the kind of the co-chairs of this group, and then we'll share the outcomes of that document with the rest of the work group. And then from there, really begin to prep for the July Policy Leadership Trust meeting. And as members that are attending will get, all the documents from across the 3 groups in preparation for that meeting. So that's where we're headed next. Really, and so we'll distribute the link to this webinar and just encourage you again to, if you have time, interest, something on your mind to share, please do so by June 3rd. And with that, we'll conclude. I really appreciate, this is not possible without all of your active involvement and input, and you're making it you've had a tremendous influence in what this document is. And so that's what we're striving for, and I think we're getting there. So thank you so much.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Have a great
Thanks,
weekend.
everybody. See you soon.
Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Everyone.